everybody. Morning, Jonathan. Great to have you on our first webinar. You currently in, is it sunny Cape Town? I can see the mountain behind you.
Barely sunny Cape Town, but it's a good start. It's nice and warm, and it'll develop into a beautiful autumn afternoon, no doubt.
The great thing is there's a fantastic rainbow just behind you, which is also fantastic. Jonathan, we've known each other for quite a number of years. You obviously you're born in South Africa. You've worked in Africa. You based in one of the great countries on the continent, which is India. But you're currently in Cape Town.
Yes.
Locked down in Cape Town. Your field of expertise, obviously, you've been in real estate for many years. You're doing amazing things in India, in the retail space, and then also in the technology space as well, and the data space. And I guess, we're going to be talking about planning the new normal. You've got a presentation first. When we talk about the new normal, we keep hearing this over the last couple of months quite a lot of times. Every day we keep hearing the new norm. And I guess it's confusing in terms of what's really the new norm and what was the old norm and whether people are going to default back to the old norm. But I think in our session of today, you've put together a couple of slides that you would like to take us through, and then we'll have a couple of questions at the end. So I'll leave it to you, Maestro.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you again. I haven't seen you for ages, save for on a Zoom screen. And thank you very much for coordinating your shirt with mine without actually making a call about it earlier today. I think that when we're faced with things relating to the new normal, we talk about and we consider something called the Great Reset. And COVID-19 has served to be a massive reset button for the world, from a society and from an economic perspective. And it has generally, up until today, been detrimental to just about everybody. I don't think anybody's really got their heads around how to recover and how to take advantage of the situation, which in itself is a good thing. I think that COVID is a wonderful opportunity for us to get together, to regain our humanity, our shared experiences, family relationships, community relationships, and in truth, what is important to us all. I just want to let you know that the little talking notes that I've got here, Kevin, are really 15, 20 minutes as you had guided. And if I'm not mistaken, it leaves some time for questions at the end or during the presentation, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, it's all yours, yeah.
Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to bring to everybody's attention is that there is a name for this event that we're living through. This COVID-19 thing is actually considered to be a black swan event. A black swan event being something of such a magnitude that we in our regular lifetimes will never ever see. If you go back 100 years, somebody would say the Spanish flu was a black swan event. And in those days, in 1918, 1919, there was as much of a giant reset as there is today. In our case, there's just so much happening in our lives. Our lives are so connected. The moment we lack our basic human connectivity, it seems as if the world is coming to an end. And this black swan event has horrible unintended consequences. The first unintended consequence is the issue revolving around our liberty. The fact that we are in a lockdown. Wherever you are watching this web on air, understand that you're sitting at home and you are with your family, but you're not where you would like to be, whether it's in the great outdoors or whether you could walk up and down the road or whether you can enjoy office conviviality. The big reset is that now we're all bound to be at home. And in 1985, a woman by the name of Faith Popcorn wrote a book called Cocooning. But in her wildest dreams, my view is that she never intended the consequences of cocooning to be like this. She wrote the book about how important it was that people work from home and work and then commute to work, and that there was something called the great three-place theory: home, work, and the dynamic of being where you in a place which wasn't home and which wasn't work. And in my field and in your field, Kevin, that's been at the shopping center, but for some it was going to the beach, going to climb a mountain. But what this Black Swan event has done is it has cut off all of that basic humanity linkage. And as a result, we're now at home, and you are probably watching this from your home, and that has its own unintended consequences. One of them is obviously you're a bit cut off from people. The second is that all the natural things that you would like to do, you can't do because of lockdown and curfew and restrictions. And the worst part of it is that a fundamental investment component of our lives is being adversely affected. All kinds of real estate have been affected by the lockdowns and by the COVID virus and the infection. And as a result, we now call this thing the new normal. Why a new normal? It's because whatever we did before the lockdown, we will not be doing probably for 4 or 5 years. From now on, we are going to have to get used to wearing a mask. We are going to have to wear gloves when we go and when we travel. We are going to have to follow certain new and, to many people, alien rules and regulations. This giant reset caused by the COVID virus is now the new normal that we have to live through. The fact that we do exercise in a particular time here in South Africa. I don't know what conditions are like in Mauritius. Mauritius is such a beautiful country, and it's blessed with such wonderful natural wilderness and oceans and facilities. I am hopeful that as Mauritians, you're able to get out. Here in South Africa, we're stuck at home until after the curfew ends at 5 o'clock in the morning. They're allowing us out like animals in a cage at 6 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock. Thereafter, we're only allowed out for essential services or to go shopping, and then we have to come back home. And if you, and then you have a curfew from 8 o'clock in the evening where you're not allowed to be out your home at all, and there's no shopping and there are no deliveries or anything of that nature. And when you think about that, from a real estate point of view, it means that all your theaters and your cinemas and your promenades and waterfronts and shopping centers and airports are suddenly of no importance whatsoever. As a result of this, the new normal, certain parts of what we understood from a real estate point of view are now no longer of importance and are no longer relevant. And I'm also going to spend a little bit of time, Kevin, talking about the data and the fact that in this reset, in this new normal, we're now becoming a heck of a lot more reliant on data and on gadgetry and on technology. For many people, this was quite an invasion, and this was quite a shock to their systems, that they would be engaging over a TV screen and over a camera and all that sort of thing. For certain parts of the community, particularly the youngsters, this was natural. But for people as old and ancient as me, it's quite an affront to the way in which we've been brought up and the way that we have grown up to interact with people. But herein lies a huge opportunity. The fact that our lives are becoming much more digitalized. And for those of you who can see me, I am saluting with the Star Trek salute, because as time progresses and as our lives become a little bit more, it's very much like how life is imitating art and how life is becoming a little bit more dystopian. Suddenly, things that we saw in the movies are becoming part and parcel of our daily lives. And my message is that we must embrace it and we must not be scared of it. And then the third thing that I want to leave you with, Kevin and colleagues, is the opportunities. If I'm not mistaken, Churchill said, nothing like a crisis breeds an opportunity. Well, I respect fully that so many people have been affected by COVID-19 in the worst possible way, in Southern Africa, for example, more and more people are hungry, and more people are homeless, and more people are getting sick, and some, unfortunately, are even dying of this dreadful disease. In respect to our real estate, we've got to be cognizant of the fact that real estate, and as we are all real estate practitioners, is a bedrock of value for the fundamentals of our economy. If our real estate fails, we lose our banking system and we lose our tax base, and there are too many losses. And as a result, we've got to now start looking at our real estate for opportunity and for repurposing and for re-engineering. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each particular point. Kevin, how am I doing so far?
Great, as usual, Jonathan.
Oh,
so
thank you.
let's get through the slides, and I'll
Okay.
shoot some questions at the end. Yeah.
Terrific. So I spent a little bit more time than I'd expected on the first point about the Black Swan event. And I think that there are more qualified people than I who can speak about COVID-19. I think that I'd like to spend just a little longer on the unintended consequences as far as real estate is concerned of this Black Swan event. We've noticed that in a country like Mauritius, there is absolutely no tourism, and your beautiful country depends on tourism, and how dreadful that must be. In South Africa, tourism represents what, about 10, 12% of our GDP. But in your country, if I'm not mistaken, it's closer to 30 or 40%. And if that is the case, it must be devastating for all of you. It must be devastating because you don't have any tourists. You don't have any way of extolling the virtues of Mauritian life to people who are coming from all over the world. You have no way of exchanging views with people abroad. And more importantly, you've got no way of interacting with people and having them enjoy your wonderful hospitality. Your hotels are closed, your airlines are closed, your airports are closed. As a result, there's no travel. And the consequences to that are absolutely terrible. And from a real estate point of view, it means that things that we built are now no longer being used. And from my point of view, I'm of the old school. I still believe that you've got to kick the tires of a used motor car. It's the same with a piece of real estate. You've got to kick the doorpost every time you walk in. The point about real estate is that it's got to be used. You know, we haven't built these shopping centers and these airports so that they have become mausoleums. We have built these things so that they are used by people. And if they are not being used by people, it's costing us to maintain them in a particular degree of operation and maintenance. And it's going to cost us even more to get them up and running when in actual fact, this COVID-19 infection is completely conquered. My concern is obviously in respect to the multi-tenanted properties, the shopping centers, the offices, and the professional residential complexes. If you look at offices, the big argument abroad, particularly in Australia and in Europe and in America, is do we actually need so many offices? In India, for example, we are faced with a calamitous decision that we don't need so much office space, yet so much has already been built. And what on earth do we do with all of that office space? And I suspect that that is a big concern to a lot of property professionals, not only in Mauritius, but also in Southern Africa. We've built these things. Now, how on earth do we reuse them so that they can actually enjoy a high return on investment into the future? Otherwise, what are we going to do? We're going to knock them all down? I doubt that very much. What is very, very interesting is that in the short period of this lockdown, the world over, there are three kinds of purpose-built properties that are actually performing pretty well. And they're performing pretty well for, I think, for some particular reasons. First is the data center, the second is the industrial park, and the third is the strip mall. Why are these particular properties, out of all the properties and the types of property that we've built in our lifetimes, why on earth are these performing better? Well, the data centers are performing brilliantly because they are the repository of the connectivity in our digitalized world. And they will continue to work well. In many cases, certainly in America, they have independent power. They don't have an ESCOM problem. For those of you in Mauritius, I'm not sure if you understand that in South Africa, we may or may not have electricity when the lockdown is lifted. And I'll leave it to Kevin to explain that to you at some later stage. You need to be sitting down and you need to have a beer in your hand about that one. But certainly from an American point of view, and certainly from a European point of view, data centers are doing extremely well. For that matter, so are storage centers. People are moving from homes, they're moving from offices, and they need some place to store their paper and their furniture. So data centers and storage centers are working well. And so for that matter, as the economy is unlocked and opens up, suddenly you find industrial parks are becoming very, very beneficial. They are working much better. They are controlled environments. They have lots of people milling around, but those parks are fully engaged with manufacturing or with break of bulk activities, or they are loyalty centers, and there are facilitation centers for Amazon, other related e-commerce businesses. So what is very, very interesting is that certain types of business within each segment performs particularly well. And in that case, so does the strip mall. Out of all the retail environments where you have big shopping centers, small shopping centers, closed shopping centers, the types of shopping centers around the world that are doing the best are the strip malls, where people who are fearful of infection can park outside, literally run in, buy their goodies, get back in their motor car and go home. And we see it here in South Africa, and we see it elsewhere. The only problem that we have in Southern Africa, and I can't speak for Mauritius, Kevin will correct me where needed. In South Africa, we have a finite number of retailers, and all of retail in this country is under a great deal of pressure, and we run the risk of losing retailers because a lot of them are not going to survive this lockdown period. It's not the COVID virus that is knocking people out of business. It's actually the unintended consequence of the lockdown. Kevin, okay for that? I'll move on?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so I now want to talk a little bit about the data. I want to talk about the consequence of us all being digital, and that, again, my little Star Trek salute, because I firmly believe in the digitalization of the human species. My view, and I'm sitting here in Cape Town with a beautiful view behind me. You may think that I'm completely raving mad, but in fact, I think that I'm right. If you remember in your Star Trek, you'll remember that there was a species called the Borg, and they had absorbed technology into their body in a particular way. And over time, I suspect that will become true for the human species. Don't worry, everybody, it's not going to happen in the next 10 years, but it will happen over the next 50 years. Not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my children and in the lifetime of my children's children. It's not going to be difficult to conceptualize a little tag being added to your index finger, just behind where your fingerprint is. And that little tag will give you an automatic temperature and oxygen reading, which will just be perfect for infection management and infection control. And that, together with an iris check, will accredit you from an identity point of view, and it will accredit you from a health point of view. And when you have your cell phone, and I'm quickly calling up my Indian app, the interesting thing about my Indian app is that it actually gives me a little safety reading. It tells me that I am safe, that it's a proximity linked device. So together with my cell phone and my identity, I am able to be, my health is ascertained, my infection level is ascertained, and I can continue with my goings on and with my business and with my socialization. I think that technology has to enable us in order to get things done. But I think that it's terribly important that we understand that technology isn't as most real estate people understand. Technology is more the data. The gadgetry are mere collection devices, whether they are sensors or attenuators or they are artificial intelligence. These are things that are helping us collect information and data, and somehow it's the data that speaks to me, and I'm hopeful that it'll speak to my real estate colleagues through this webinar. It's extremely important that you understand that data elevates our understanding. And once we have an elevated understanding, we are able to describe that data in a much easier way so that it becomes understandable to as many people as possible. I'm reminded of a wonderful little story about why books were the custodian of all knowledge during the Middle Ages. It's because only a few people could read and write. But in these days of the democratization of data, and more importantly, the digitalization of our lives, everybody has an equal access to information. So why don't we spend most of our time trying to make sure that data is as easily understandable and as quickly understandable as possible to as many people as possible? So that dashboard represents a visual way, an easy to understand way, and it's something against which you can then evaluate your data. There's nothing worse than being given a chart without understanding whether the chart is good or whether it is bad. You know, I'm waving my arm, and this to me, with my elbow on the left-hand side and my tip end of my finger on the right-hand side, this is a positive leaning curve, and this is a negative leaning curve, right? I think you understand that. But a lot of people don't, and they don't understand it because it's not graphically represented. There has to be a baseline of information, and most importantly, there have to be meaningful benchmarks. Otherwise, the numbers don't mean anything. And this is where, from a real estate point of view, we are seeing the rise of PropTech. PropTech, by the way, is a component of all technology, which is and then there's a further category called financial tech or fintech, and then there's PropTech. And PropTech is anything from the built environment all the way through to the data in respect to the sales in a shopping center, how many people are walking past a particular store, all those sorts of things. And gadgets collect that data, and data scientists make sense of that data. And remember that technology is agnostic to a fixed category. And most importantly, it's a wonderful way of evaluating the overall management of your asset. I'm not sure how we ever did this without any data. I'm not sure how we built so many shopping centers in South Africa without proper research and without proper information. Did you know that in South Africa, and I've been told this by 2 or 3 reliable sources, that there are around 10,000 shopping centers, but that after this black swan event, probably 5,000 will have to be repurposed. About 5,000, to my way of thinking, don't deserve to exist for the very simple reason that they shouldn't have been built in the first place, or they've been poorly tenanted, or they were spuriously tenanted in the sense that a lot of those tenants were never going to survive in the first place. I'm also very passionate, Kevin, as you well know, about this whole thing about transformative technology. The fact that we can get so-called first world technology into a complex market and an industrializing market. It's so terribly important that the apex of all cell phones, and I probably am going to upset everybody by saying the Apple cell phone is at the top of the tree, as it were. And it's interesting to see how this thing is being slowly is gaining traction in more complex markets. In India, for example, it represents 18% of every single cell phone user. In Southern Africa, I understand it represents about 3%. It's got a lot to do with cost. It's got a lot to do with the overwhelming technology that these things have. But what is interesting is that over time, there is an absorption of what we call first world technology. And I'm a firm believer that living in a complex market like India and in East and in Southern Africa, it's terribly, terribly important that that transformative technology happens as fast and as seamless as possible. Remember, technology and data are the democratizing agents of our lifetimes now. Kevin, can I move on?
Absolutely. Would you mind sort of wrapping up in the next couple of minutes?
Yes. So when we look at the problems and the effect of the coronavirus, I'm sure that we've all we've all taken a view that property values are going to change. Well, I'm not sure if any of you have been looking at the South African REIT market, and certainly I've been looking at what's been happening in India. There's been almost a 35 to a 45% swipe of value. We've seen REIT values almost collapse, probably a little hysterically. Some are coming back in value. The good ones are coming back strongly. The weak ones are the ones that will languish and will have assets where debt will not be repaid. And I'm sad to say some may even go bankrupt if they're not properly rescued. And it's terribly important that when you start looking at your own portfolio, whether it is in a REIT or whether it is in your own private portfolio, that you designate one of the next these three identifiers to your properties. Some are stars, some are cows, and some are dogs. By the way, a very famous American General Electric CEO coined this phrase some time ago. It's a little bit stark and it's a little bit aggressive, but I think that in the difficult times call for difficult decisions. A star is a property that will survive on its own. A cow is a property that needs some feeding, but is a stalwart throughout. And a dog is unfortunately the kind of property that you may not necessarily need to have built in the first place. And most dogs are going to be on the distressed heap shortly. And it's terribly important that property practitioners start mercilessly identifying which of their properties in their portfolio are stars, cows, and dogs. And it's terribly important that they then have a plan. And my last point is the one around solutioneering and repurposing of assets. That once you've identified within the cows and the dogs which properties may need some repurposing, you must understand that the replacement cost is higher than the historical construction cost, and therein lies the opportunity. Can your building be repurposed? You have to look at the market, obviously. You have to do a strategic leasing and a strategic user plan. But most importantly, if you don't, you're going to be left with massive vacancy. You're going to be left with a hole in your operating cost budget, and you're going to be left with space that nobody wants, and people will not want to come to your buildings. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's great. You've given a sort of holistic picture of what's happening, and I really like the part where you talked about data and gadget, because very often we get hooked on technology, but then we sort of misunderstand that, you know, at the end of the day, technology is worth nothing without the data. So that's the core of what we need to focus on. You know, if we had data, for example, during this COVID-19 crisis, we would know who lives where and who's infected and who might be infected, et cetera, et cetera. That's all about the data. Yeah.
Yes.
And the same thing as well applies to real estate. An example, as you know, Mauritius, I know you were in Mauritius last year. I think, you know, you had a beautiful holiday in Mauritius.
Yes.
Kind of a long weekend, you know, and we've been having tourists for many years, for almost 4 decades.
Yes.
And yet we haven't got a system to collect data about concerning our tourists who've been coming to Mauritius. So we've probably had around more than 25 to 30 million of tourists that have come to Mauritius over the last 4 decades. And yet we haven't captured data to really understand what people like and what they like to do, where they come from, and what they aspire when they come to Mauritius, and how do we eventually get them to come back, for example. Yeah. So that's something which I'm trying to push with the Association of Hotel Owners in Mauritius to say, okay, they need to work with the Ministry of Tourism to see how we can put something together to capture data. Yeah.
Yes.
I've got a few questions for you.
Before you ask a question, can I make a little observation?
Sure.
That in actual fact, from a data science point of view, the first data point that you could use to determine where who your customers are, who your visitors are, is the boarding pass. And the airlines and the airport have all of this information. I'll bet you they've got 40 years worth of data sitting there. All that you require is to start merging those data points and make sense of it. So you will be able to work out very quickly from where do the tourists come? How do they come? Which airlines are the most dominant? Probably Air Mauritius, obviously. And then you could match that to your hotel statistics, which I'm sure you have, as to where people are staying, how long are people staying. So once you have that basic demographic in respect to who's coming, where they're coming from, are they coming as families or are they coming as business people and all that sort of thing, you have a broad picture of what your customer looks like. The specifics relating to who they are, it's all on their boarding pass. And I know this because I did an exercise at Mumbai Airport about a year back, where we worked with Mumbai Airport's duty free, and we found they had an interesting question. Why were bags of children's nursing milk being sold at the airport? They couldn't understand. And what we did was we linked the purchase at the duty free to the boarding pass. And we then discovered that 99% of every single powdered milk packet was being bought by Chinese people who were buying it in Mumbai because Indian food quality in that particular category was greater and better than it was at home, where unfortunately in China at the time, a lot of these products were being mixed with other products to make it seem that it was nutritious and good. And it was very interesting using the data that we were able to then mine which airlines were affected. So we could then run a special campaign. So we could say to people, if you buy three, if you I beg your pardon, if you buy two, you get three, or something of that nature. It's amazing what you can do with data. I'm a firm believer, like you, Kevin, that God gave us 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. Use it in that proportion. It's amazing what happens when you adopt an observation-based decision-making process.
Absolutely. Great factual example of yours. Yeah. I've got a couple of questions and we're going to try to wrap up in the next 10 minutes. So
sure.
If you could sort of, make it sort of sharp and straight to the point, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Question is, you talked about valuation. Yep. So you said, value is going to come down by sort of 20% plus, etc. You've seen that already happening in your part of the world, in India, for example. So what do you see? Do you see things picking up, or is that a re-rating or a rebase of asset values?
Kevin, I think it's got a lot to do with the rebasing. I think that valuations, and I know you're a valuer, I think that the problem with us as valuers is that we're always looking for comparables, and we're always dependent on what market conditions are all about. And at the moment, nobody's going out there and doing valuations for the very simple reason that we are completely gutted in respect to higher vacancies, no rentals being collected, operating cost budgets being decimated, no customers to our shops, no office people coming into the offices, all of that sort of thing. All the worst things that are happening in our built environment are happening. But from a strictly speaking valuations point of view, and I'm a strong subscriber to the RICS calamity valuation technique. The RICS Red Book has a corollary document all about calamities and how to value in a calamity. The first thing it says is stop and assess the market. And what we are seeing in the market right now is a diminishment of value. The property themselves are going to retain their value, because if the waterfront in Cape Town was an important, beautiful asset, it will always be an important, beautiful asset. Nobody in this market, or for the next 5 years, is going to build anything to compete against it. So that's positive news. But the big problem is that the actual asset is diminished by lesser people visiting it. And what impact does that have? It has an impact in respect to lesser spend. Lesser spend means lower revenue share rentals for retail tenants. It means less extraneous spend in all sorts of other avenues, including obviously space on higher non-GLA income. It means that income streams are diminished and compacted. It means people aren't paying their rent. So you've got a massive amount of money sitting in your unpaid. But the problem is that you're running a shopping center, so you've still got to maintain your operating systems and your staff and your cleaning and your security and all of that sort of thing, which doesn't bode well for the property. And from a strictly speaking valuations point of view, what has happened on the markets, on the REIT market, is that most of these big counters have had a swipe of between 25 to 45%, simply because people don't know what's going to happen in the future, and they would prefer to take the valuation cut now than to sit and wait it out and see how things are materializing. If you look at India,
which obviously, John, which obviously impacts on your loan to value, because you still have got debt to service, etc. How do you think the banks are going to react? Yeah, the debt funders.
Well, I can't speak for any of the banks. Suffice to say that I'm aware of 3 South African REITs that are dangerously close to not having sufficient cash flow to cover the cost of their borrowings. And we're aware, because all this information is public domain information, we're aware that most REITs in this country have a loan to book ratio of around 30, 35, some of them 38%, which means that they've got to watch their cash flow very carefully. If they drop in this country below 75% distribution, they lose their tax structure and their tax benefits. We've seen what happened. There are 3 or 4 of them that are dangerously close, and that is extremely worrisome. And I would be worried, not least of all if I was the bank, but I would be worried if I was the landlord, because from a landlord's point of view, it's very seldom that landlords go bankrupt. If a landlord goes bankrupt of that magnitude, it impacts your banking system. And thank God the South African banking system, and I understand about the Mauritian banking system, is almost rock solid. It's almost impervious to these shocks. But the moment you start having landlords go bankrupt, it's going to start testing everybody's resolve. I think over the next couple of months, we're going to have more clarity in respect to property valuations. Already in India, the cap rates have started creeping up, reflecting people's expectations on the property fundamentals being weak. And over time, we're going to get that correction.
Speaking about landlords, there's always been an interesting relationship between landlords and tenants.
Yes.
I used to sort of say, it's kind of a love-hate relationship between the two. In this crisis, what are your views? I mean, should they, talk more? Should they share the pain that's ahead of for a month or maybe a couple of years? How do you see that relationship changing, if ever?
So, Kevin, I think that being here during the lockdown, because normally I'm based in Bangalore, as you know, I think that I'm living in a parallel universe. I've been reading documents coming out from South African property owners and South African property REITs and organizations that purport to represent property owners. And I can't help thinking that they are shy in respect to speaking to their respective tenants. And I see tenants making unctuous demands on landlords that would not be acceptable anywhere else in the world. My base of experience, and has been for the last 12 years, is East Africa and in India, where we made a point of always speaking to each other. So in India, the Retailers Association and the Shopping Center Association are in talks. And in actual fact, they've just issued a whole bevy of protocols and standard operating procedures, how to open your shop and how to open your shopping center. I know, Kevin, I've been sharing them with you because you and I share information regularly. But what is so interesting is that the level of detail shows the commitment by both sides. They don't see each other as being acrimonious. Yes, we are always acrimonious because I want the highest rent because I'm a landlord, and as a tenant, I want to pay the lowest rent. But that isn't the means of our relationship. We have to be adversarial. But in actual fact, during times like this, we have to also talk to each other. There are other ways of dealing with a seemingly intractable situation. I'm not seeing many signs of landlords and tenants talking to each other about the tenure of their lease and the capital value of their lease, and as a result, extending their lease period and accommodating the rent-free period. I'm not
Which is
seeing
interesting.
that.
Which is interesting, Jonathan. If I can ask you, I mean, you've taken
Sure.
two examples of India, where you normally base, and then also East Africa, where you used to be based. I mean, you used to
Yes.
live. You've lived a number of years in Kenya, for example.
Yes.
You've used those two markets basically to say, landlords and tenants traditionally, they spend their time talking. Do you think it's to do with culture?
I have a funny suspicion it's got a lot to do with people not knowing what they should know. I think that some people have been caught short. The times in South Africa from a development and from a real estate point of view, Kevin, have been really good. I wish I could say the same in India, where times are always troubling. You've always got bank issues, and you've got state issues and government issues and all those sorts of things. Here in South Africa, it's a parallel universe, in the sense that things, if they're good, they're good, and if they're bad, oh my God, let's just put our head in the soil and hope that it'll all go away kind of attitude. I suspect, and by the way, the intimation, I derive my view from the number of real estate investment trusts that have listed in the last 2 or 3 years on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. It's quite remarkable. It's wonderful to see from a corporate and from a structural professional point of view, but it's also quite dangerous because a lot of them are undermanaged. A lot of them are in a position where their values are suspect, and one has to look carefully at revaluing or reassessing the values that are coming through. And a lot of them are overborrowed. And suddenly we are faced with this black swan event, which threatens their very survival. And one wonders how prepared they actually are. What is very interesting is that the same how prepared they are question came to me when we started the lockdown on about the 15th or 18th of March in India. I was here in South Africa. Immediately we put together, I was privileged to be part of a group of people with the Retailers Association and the Shopping Center Association. We put together a communication to tenants and landlords. Those landlords that wanted to cooperate and be involved were welcomed, and same with tenants. Right now, thousands of professionals are sharing views all of the time. A unified submission has been given to the Indian government asking and appealing for specific kinds of support in respect to retail and real estate in India. I don't see that kind of thing coming out of South Africa. And more importantly, the major shopping center landlords in India have started webinars like you've got here, together with a number of what I call talk shops, the opportunity for people to vent and to air their view, retailer and landlord, together on the same webinar, as it were, and sharing their views about what to do and how to do it. We are now slowly starting to see the seeds of this come through. The new protocols are absolutely remarkable. They are enforceable, they are easy to apply, and they don't cost a packet to implement. And slowly but surely, shopping centers are coming alive. And the shopping center industry, by the way, just to give you a little taste of by some numbers, if I'm not mistaken, Indian shopping centers represent 70 to 80 billion dollars a year in retail sales. And that only represents 10% of total retail in all of India. So the shopping center segment is small, but extremely important. And it swamps whatever we've experienced in Africa, certainly in South Africa. And they've got to talk to each other. Why can't the shopping center and the tenants in this country talk to each other with a degree of decency and politeness? Interesting.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Jonathan. I mean, they should definitely talk. Let's see what's going to happen. Sure. Jonathan, 1 minute. We need to close. It's been really enjoyable on my side to go through your presentation. What would be your closing remark? What's the future?
Oh, I think the future is rosy. I think the future is rosy because once we've got out of this COVID virus pandemic and we've stabilized our social lives and our private lives, I think that this is the respite that we've needed, Kevin, to evaluate our professional lives and our professional careers, and to engage with something that was a little alien in the beginning, and that was things relating to technology. We've now been able, in a short 3 months, to engage with technology which would otherwise have taken 10 years for us to be involved with. I think that the beautiful thing about this COVID virus epidemic, aside from the death and the desperation and the hunger, is that there is always a cherry on the top. I'm my blood group. I'm a B positive blood group person. I'm always like a kettle boiling and happy to be alive and engaging. I see the positive in a negative. I'm the guy making lemonade out of lemons, and I'm the guy churning the milk into butter so I could walk out of a hole. My view is that black swans turn into beautiful and unique creatures. And at the end of the day, what we will become what we want to become if we are positive about getting through this together.
Fantastic. Well said, Jonathan. I like your, I see you've put up your slide with your African proverb. If you think you're too small to make a difference, you haven't spent a night with a mosquito. You're absolutely well said.
Just on that, by the way, I use that with a lot of my presentations when I'm back in India, and the whole room convulses in laughter, and they think, but that's an Indian saying. That's an Indian saying. They shout it out to me in Hindi. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan. Keep well in Cape Town, and hopefully in the next month or two, you're going to be back home, which is in India. Yeah.
Yes. That would be very good, Kevin. Thank you. And best wishes to everybody.
Thank you to everybody.